Hello, honeys. It is Tuesday, and you know what that means. We are back with The Buzz, a whole list of new headlines for you from the arts world in the last week. Before we begin today, a little bit of a heads up. Our guest for our Thursday interview episode, set to release this week, can't actually join me for the recording until Thursday, so it's possible that episode may drop on Friday instead. Thank you in advance for your patience. I'm so excited to have us hear from Vulcan and Kafani. And with that announcement sorted, let's get started. Follow-ups first, of course. Jack Shainman Gallery has fired back at Odile Donald Odita, responding at length to allegations in the artist's lawsuit that the gallery wouldn't return his artworks to him. They claim, in turn, that he significantly overpriced his art and owed them a ton. The gallery said in its own filing that it initially undertook a payment structure of $14,000 a month because, quote, Odita claimed that he was living beyond his means, end quote, and kept raising Odita's monthly stipend until 2024, at which point the artist had been given $586,000 in loans by the gallery. The gallery said this was a, quote, unsustainable level in light of what had become sluggish sales of Odita's artworks, end quote. Odita then attempted, they say, to raise the prices on his works above the recommended 20% to 160%, at which point the gallery claimed that it had the right to, quote unquote, retain 5 works allegedly valued at $650,000. Jack Shainman Gallery allegedly released those works to Odita by quote-unquote oral agreement on November 9th this year, but they say he must still repay his remaining loans of over $292,000. There is no response yet from the artist or his lawyers as of the time of this recording. And explicit content warning, because it's in the name, Russia moved last week to label Pussy Riot an extremist organization. A hearing to do so was scheduled for December 15th at Moscow's Tversky court after Prosecutor General Alexander Gutsen filed a lawsuit with the intention of banning the feminist punk rock art collective's activities in Russia. The timing ironically overlapped with the performance of Police State, a durational performance artwork at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago by member Nadia Tolokonikova. Tolokonikova's previous performance of Police State at the Museum of Contemporary Art LA was also notably shut down in June after President Donald Trump sent National Guard troops to stop California protests against ICE raids, despite the objections of Governor Gavin Newsom. The Why We Care Here, as Art News puts it, quote, members of the Russian art group have previously been labeled as foreign agents, criminals, and terrorists, even added to an international wanted list. But the lawsuit is the first time Pussy Riot is facing official allegations of extremism, end quote. The art world has been reflecting also this week on the lessons from the case of the Baroque portrait of Contessa Colleoni painted by Giuseppe Gislandi, and which spurred an investigation into an Argentinian homeowner when it appeared in a real estate listing earlier this year, to which there is still no clear resolution because of the legal loopholes surrounding individual owners of stolen art. Alexander Herman, the director of the Institute of Art and Law, writes in the Art newspaper, quote, the case raises questions about Nazi-looted art held in private collections. While the leading museums and associations in Europe have adopted standards for dealing with claims for Nazi loot in their holdings, there is no equivalent for private collectors, end quote. We're now seeing the question, should there be, asked quite a bit more frequently. We also learned that the Art Dealers Association will replace their long-running art show with a new 2026 fair. After canceling the 2025 edition of its flagship art show, established in 1988, the ADAA announced its self-titled new fair will run November 12th through the 16th next year in the same location as the now retired version at the Park Avenue Armory in New York. The cancellation of the former art show, which supported a social services nonprofit on New York's Lower East Side titled the Henry Street Settlement, was a surprising move and dubbed at the time as a quote-unquote strategic pause by the organization. The new fair, however, is intended to support a broader range of art and museums, highlighting the work of the ADAA Foundation's grant-issuing body. That body was itself established in 1972. ADAA Executive Director Kinsey Robb said in statements that the organization's quote-unquote new era will be, quote, more responsive to the cultural needs of our time, end quote. And in the ultimate follow-up, the Art News contributors have selected their 25 defining art events of 2025, and we're happy to say that list includes several of our own past headlines. Ones like AI revealing new Nazca lines, the removal of Sally Mann photographs from the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, the Whitney's Independent Study Program being put on hold, new auction records for female artists, the wildfires of LA and their effects on local arts communities, and a summer of gallery closures. For the remaining ones, please feel free to check out that list yourself. And now for some news stories. Art Basel, one of the biggest events of the year, saw Beeple unleash pooping robot dogs modeled after Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. Quote, Regular Animals by Beeple, aka Mike Winkleman, is part satire, part dystopia, part slapstick theater, end quote, according to our source authors, in which a pen of robot dogs, or perhaps pigs, were fitted with quote-unquote grotesquely lifelike heads of the two tech giants, plus Pablo Picasso, Andy Warhol, Jeff Bezos, and Beeple himself. The little robots walked around and, quote, at intervals likely engineered for maximum dramatic tension, they tip backward and eject a printed image from their backsides, end quote, of whatever they see in front of them in the style of whoever's head they wear. For example, our sources say the Warhol dog spits out Warhol-esque images, and the same goes for Picasso, quote, though I never did see what a Muskian or Zuckerbergian image looked like, end quote. So why, honeys, are we talking about pooping robots? Well, because they could be seen as a cathartic exploration of AI, automation, and the platforms that shape our reality. Yet meaning versus value lies at the center of each question raised by these robots as well. One dealer, who asked to remain anonymous, described the work as decadent in the way that signifies moral and cultural decline, not in the sense of chocolate cake, arguing that its spectacle panders to the crowd but dodges complexity and disguises thin ideas behind technological bombast. Quote, this is the clearest example of the lack of scholarship in the industry. Sure, it's nice that people care about it, but this whole project tramples on the history of digital and video art and makes it a bit, end quote. All the same, every edition of the robots had sold by the end of the first VIP day for $100,000 US apiece each, according to several outlets. Our sources report that Iranian resilience was on show at a recent auction of 120 works by leading modern and contemporary Iranian artists, hosted by Tehran Auction, the country's sole major auction house. The sale earned a total 134 trillion toman, or roughly 1.5 million US dollars before fees, on October 4th. Art News reports that figure is especially striking in a country cut off from international banking, facing water shortages, and struggling to import essential medicines. They also noted that at the same time in London, however, works by Iranian artists sold at Sotheby's and Christie's for the lowest amounts in years. Meanwhile, Tehran Auction's founder, Ali Reza Sami Azar, says the real value of domestic art spending continues to rise, with more Iranians investing in art than ever before. Which brings us to the why we care. This is, of course, significant evidence of the, quote, Iranian elite's resilience, end quote. It also, in the words of Art News, quote, reflects how sanctions, geopolitics, and shifting tastes have created a booming closed domestic market in Iran and a stagnant one abroad, end quote. Last week also saw a Fabergé egg, dubbed the Mona Lisa of the decorative arts, sell for a record-breaking 30.2 million US dollars. It was the top billing in the winter egg and important works by Fabergé from a princely collection. Sale on Tuesday at Christie's London, and the egg, described by the auction house as, quote, among the most lavish of Fabergé's imperial creations, end quote, was thought to be lost before it went up for sale at Christie's in Geneva in 1994, when it set a record for the first time. This sale marks its third record break overall. On top of its monetary value, the egg also has a unique history. The Art newspaper explains that it was created by Alma Teresia Peel, one of the few women in Fabergé's St. Petersburg workshop, and was fabricated by her uncle and Fabergé's chief jeweler, Albert Holmstrom. But the egg news does not stop there. New Zealand police have recovered a quote-unquote James Bond-encrusted Fabergé egg that was swallowed by a 32-year-old man who allegedly picked up the egg at Auckland's Partridge Jewelers. Police arrived within minutes of the staff's report to detain the suspect, and now nature has run its course after 6 days of dedicated surveillance. Police statements from Friday last week confirmed that the special edition locket, created as a tribute to the coveted Fabergé egg at the center of the James Bond caper Octopussy, had been recovered and was in police custody. And in case you wonder why we're talking so much about Fabergé and their eggs, they're one of the world's most storied jewelers, best known for the about 50 lavish commissioned eggs they made for the Russian imperial family in the period between 1885 and the Russian Revolution in 1917. We also heard that a con artist was charged for a fraudulent sale of a Courbet painting. Thomas Doyle, age 68, was arrested on November 14th by members of the FBI's art crime team and charged with one count of wire fraud, which carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. The charges are related to his, in practice, laundering of an 1844 oil painting titled Mother and Child on a Hammock. Through his business partner and the artist, Shalva Sarukhanishvili, then through Jill Newhouse Gallery in New York, and eventually to Art News top 200 collector John Landau. Landau purchased the work for just $125,000 US, despite Doyle's initial purchase point of the work at $550,000 from London gallery owner Patrick Matheson and consigner Nicholas Hall Gallery. We found it notable that our sources included the fact that during a 2010 sentencing hearing in which Doyle pled guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud for orchestrating the fraudulent purchase of a Corot work for $800,000, the residing judge in that case noted that Doyle had been convicted 11 times over the previous 34 years. And now here we are in 2025. All parties involved, except Doyle, have made statements to the press that they will solve this all in court. The Denver Post reported last week that the Cambodian government has formally reached out to the family of Emma C. Bunker, an art historian who died in 2021 and who sat on the board of the Denver Art Museum for her records and archival materials. The request follows the repatriation of 11 Asian artifacts in recent years to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, which had primarily been donated to the museum by Bunker. The former board member was never charged, but came under scrutiny several years ago after it was found that she sourced acquisitions of several works from accused smuggler of looted Southeast Asian antiquities and art dealer himself, Douglas Latchford, who died before he could stand trial in 2020. The Denver Post continued to report on Bunker's ties to Latchford after her 2021 death, releasing a 3-part investigation in 2022 alleging that Bunker helped Latchford use the museum as a, quote, way station for looted art, end quote. The museum had cut ties with Bunker, removing her name from its Southeast Asian gallery wall and returning a sizable donation to her family in 2023. Attorney Bradley Gordon wrote on behalf of the Cambodian government, quote, "We are very eager to consult these materials as we continue our search for several important statues originating from the country," end quote. We also heard Kim Delaney, the former vice president of education and programs at the DuSable Museum of Chicago, filed a whistleblower and retaliatory discharge lawsuit with the Cook County Circuit Court on December 1st. She is seeking reinstatement, back pay, front pay, compensatory damages, punitive damages, civil penalties, all under the Illinois Whistleblower Act, plus attorney fees and injunctive relief, aka a court order to prevent the museum from committing further alleged violations. The DuSable Museum, founded in Chicago in 1961, is considered one of the oldest public museums in the country dedicated to African American visual art, and it has vehemently denied these allegations in its statements to the press, saying the decision to terminate Delaney, quote, "followed a thorough and fair review process conducted in accordance with our established policies and procedures," end quote. We find it notable, though, that Leslie Guy, former chief curator at the museum, settled a lawsuit in Cook County against it after her 2017 termination. She, too, claimed that some vendors and guest curators had gone unpaid and that, quote, "various grants and other donor funds reserved for specific projects were depleted and being misspent on other museum functions despite grant requirements and without prior approval of the various grant donors," end quote. We'll keep you posted on what happens next. Also last week, unseen photos of Rosa Parks and others returned to Montgomery, Alabama 7 decades later. Photos taken by the late civil rights photographer Matt Herron depicting the iconic activist at the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965 have been made public for the first time via a release to the Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery on Thursday, and, quote, "they illustrate aspects of her legacy that are often overlooked," end quote, says AP News. Donna Beazle, the museum's director, said the pictures are a reminder that Parks's activism began before and extended well beyond her most well-known act of defiance. The photographer's wife, now 88 years old, Janine Herron, said that the photos were discovered from a contact sheet housed in a library at Stanford University, but hadn't been selected for print back then because they were blurry or included people whose names weren't as well known. In the case of Parks's photos, she's seen sitting among the crowd looking away from the camera. The story deserves a spotlight because, one, Janine Herron is joining forces with historians and surviving civil rights activists in Alabama to reunite the work with the communities that they depict. She stated, quote, "it's so important to get that information from history into local people's understanding of what their families did," end quote. And more tangibly, there were moments of validation, reunion, and reconnection decades later between march participants and other quote-unquote everyday activists as they viewed the photos together on Thursday ahead of the donation in a local viewing ceremony at Lincoln Normal School, an HBCU in Marion, Marion, a rural town in the Black Belt of Alabama. And talking money for a minute, Swiss voters emphatically voted down a new inheritance tax on Sunday that billionaires warned would lead to an exodus. 78% voted no on the tax proposed by the country's left-wing Social Democrats Party. If successful, it would have taxed all inheritances and gifts of more than 50 million Swiss francs, or about 62.3 million US dollars, at a rate of 50%. But it could have had huge financial implications if it passed, as the nation has one of the highest ratios of billionaires per 1 million inhabitants, nearly 10 to 1, according to UBS. Sources say the presence of Art Basel and Hauser and Wirth and favorable tax laws for the ultra-wealthy, quote, make it an attractive place for art collectors to reside, or at least park some of their wealth, end quote. Meaning, we could have seen some pretty big action in the art world had this all gone down. And 'tis the season, apparently, for discoveries, announcements, and awards. So here's a breakdown of the ones from just this last week. A team of archaeologists and cultural heritage researchers working for the last 6 years in the mountains near Yulin in China's northern Shanxi province uncovered a network of 573 stone forts, the earliest of which date to approximately 2800 BCE using aerial scanning technology. The head of the team, Ma Mingji, noted that, quote, the fortified sites likely served as focal points for defense and social organization, protecting the smaller villages around them, end quote. And because they were built over the course of several thousand years, they show the evolution of how fortified communities were constructed in ancient China. Meanwhile, the UK Houses of Parliament reported evidence of human activity dating back almost 6,000 years has been discovered by archaeologists working at the Palace of Westminster in England on a 3-year restoration program. The items, some of which predate Stonehenge by over a millennium, include a medieval leather boot, shoe soles and straps, fragments of a 19th century decorated clay tobacco pipe, a Roman altar fragment, more than 60 struck flint flakes, 1 worked tool, and more. They were unearthed from sand deposits that once formed part of Thorny Island, the site of prehistoric hunting, fishing, and gathering communities. And our sources say these findings are expected to influence the forthcoming design and construction decisions of the restoration. We learned Ibrahim Mahama has become the first African artist to top ArtReview's Power 100 list as well. The magazine's 24th annual ranking of figures who have most shaped the art world this year features the Ghanaian who rose to international prominence through monumental quilt-like installations made from jute sacks and discarded textiles, materials tied to Ghana's cocoa trade, which he drapes across entire buildings, creating visual parallels to the works of Christo and Jean-Claude, a formerly featured artist couple on our show. There are 2 main why we cares here. First, Mahama's work addresses themes of labor, extraction, and exploitation, which are not necessarily the most popular topics in art, ones that are not always first to get the spotlight. He has also, however, used his own visibility to create practical change, reinvesting gallery profits into institutions that host residencies, workshops, etc., such as Red Clay Studio, the Savannah Center for Contemporary Art, and Nkrumah Villini in his hometown of Tamale. Congrats to Mahama on a very well-deserved win. And since we brought them up, we may as well tell you French artist JR will wrap Pont Neuf in Paris as a Christo tribute. The French photographer and street artist announced his plans for the historic 761-foot-long standing bridge spanning the Seine in Paris next June in a tribute to the collaborative husband and wife artistic duo. Christo's nephew and director of the Christo and Jean-Claude Foundation, Vladimir Yavachev, reportedly approached the artist with the project to mark the 30-year anniversary of its initial staging. JR has created large-scale public artworks addressing intersecting issues of migration, urbanization, climate, and conflict for more than 2 decades, which is notable in itself, but we also wanted to make note of the fact that 5 years after the death of Christo, his and Jean-Claude's monumental visions are still remaking iconic landmarks. And on the topic of France, the Louvre Museum's board voted on Thursday to raise its ticket prices for tourists as part of a larger effort to raise funds to support infrastructure changes at the institution. Visitors from outside the European Economic Area will now pay €32 or $37 starting on January 14th, up 45% from the current price of €22 or $25. What caught our attention here is that the largest complaints have come from France's CFDT Culture Labor Union, which represents some Louvre workers, and has called the situation, quote, absurd and unjust, end quote, as, quote, people from the Middle East will pay a higher price to access foundational and symbolic works of their own culture, end quote, than their French counterparts. They say, quote, the very public you are targeting will experience this as discrimination, end quote. In happier news, El Salvador will debut its inaugural inaugural pavilion at the 2026 Venice Biennale. Their selection, Salvadoran-American artist J. Oscar Molina, was quoted by our sources as saying that he is filled with joy and happiness. As an artist, I feel very blessed, end quote. The National Director for Museums and Exhibition Spaces of the Ministry of Culture of El Salvador, Astrid Bahamond, will be the commissioner, while El Salvador-born poet and art historian Alejandra Cabezas is curating. Molina himself was born in 1971 but fled the country at the age of 16 with his family amid the nation's civil war, eventually settling in New York and turning to art making full-time in his 30s. The nation's contribution will be staged at the Palazzo Mora and is titled Cartographies of the Displaced. It will feature at least 15 of Molina's recognizable Children of the World sculptures made of wire, concrete, and mesh, in which Artforum says are, quote, intended to make visible the struggles of immigrants to the U.S., end quote, as they are inspired by Molina's own memories of his migration. Which leads us to a Why We Care that's even bigger than the addition of a new nation, a Latin American nation, to the Venice Biennale. Molina said he hopes that his pavilion will have a strong resonance during this time when forced migration is a global issue. This may be why each sculpture in Venice will reportedly be accompanied by a QR code that will lead to interactive messages from different displaced communities around the world, including one of Molina telling his own story. A few quick obituaries for this week. The Martin Parr Foundation confirmed to the BBC that, quote, one of the sharpest and most influential photographers of British life, end quote, Martin Parr, passed away at age 73 at his home in Bristol. The cause was not specified, but Parr was diagnosed with myeloma, a form of bone marrow cancer, in 2021. Art News writes that he was known for his pictures of tourists that, quote, were both genuinely curious explorations of their lifestyle and wry indictments of it, end quote. The second is for so-called starchitect Frank Gehry, who died of a brief respiratory illness on Friday in Santa Monica at age 96. The most famous of his museum designs was for the Guggenheim Bilbao, which opened in 1997. Art News writes that his designs, quote, often composed of sloping, incongruous forms, helped move art institutions in a new direction, showing that they need not only be set in neoclassical pantheons or hard-edged modernist structures, end quote. And finally, one for Raphael Ethier, a beloved musician and inspiration to the likes of Bad Bunny. The founder of the legendary salsa band El Gran Combo de Puerto Rico passed at age 99, said an attorney for the Ethier family, confirming the musician's death to the radio station WKAQ late on Saturday, but not providing a cause. Said Marlese Cifre, mayor of Ponce, quote, Puerto Rico has lost a giant, a man whose life was dedicated to elevating our identity through the art and rhythm that distinguishes us to the world, end quote. The Pantone Color Institute has been announcing a color of the year since 1999 when it declared a muted blue called cerulean as the hue of 2000, but is now under fire for its 2026 selection, a shade of white that many are describing as tone deaf. Pantone's 114201, also known as Cloud Dancer, stands in sharp contrast to 2025's choice, the first shade of brown to receive the title, and known as Mocha Mousse. It is being seen as quite the statement at a time when the political significance of whiteness has been at the center of debates across the US and Europe. Instagram commenters, for example, on Pantone's announcement demonstrated a range of reactions from quote-unquote bored to seeing the quote-unquote colorless color choice as a quote recession indicator, end quote. For their part, Pantone officials say it's a quote symbol of calming influence in a frenetic society rediscovering the value of measured consideration and quiet reflection, end quote. And Vogue does note that white quote does not disturb, does not rock the boat, end quote, so it may have been seen as a safe choice. Even writers for the New York Times point out that there are many associations with white across cultures, the white dove of peace, the baptismal gown, even in some Asian countries, mourning, so it's not an entirely meaningless choice. But all the same, other statements from the Pantone Color Institute, for example from VP Lori Pressman, seem to, quote, suggest whiteness as a baseline, the color if it is indeed a color to which everyone must compare themselves, end quote. Additional statements like the one that, quote, skin tones did not factor into this at all, end quote, seem to imply a strange sort of naivete, a sort of racial colorblindness from the entity that bills itself as the, quote, leading source of color expertise, end quote. It may be too much to ask from the company that chose a shade of pink because it was, quote unquote, brave and fearless at the height of Barbiecore 2 years ago for its color of the year to really think through some of these implications, but we think they should still in this current context, and we're asking you to as well a little bit. Last week also saw Trump award medals to the Kennedy Center honorees in an Oval Office ceremony. The president had said back in August that he was, quote, about 98% involved, end quote, in choosing those honorees. When he personally announced them, actor Sylvester Stallone, singers Gloria Gaynor and George Strait, the rock band Kiss, and actor-singer Michael Crawford at the Kennedy Center. We're featuring this story because it is the first slate chosen under his leadership, yet it also demonstrates his continued meddling in the affairs of the institution, as honorees have traditionally been selected by a bipartisan committee and announced via press release. Trump went on to brag as well about hosting the Kennedy Center Honors program as a sort of TV event host, quote, at the request of a certain television network, end quote. That would be a first in presidential history if it happens, and is a seemingly ego-based move, as he went on to immediately say, quote, I've watched some of the people that host. Jimmy Kimmel was horrible. If I can't beat out Jimmy Kimmel in terms of talent, then I don't think I should be president, end quote. We also learned that London's Serpentine and the New York-based Flag Art Foundation have announced the establishment of the UK's largest contemporary art prize of $270,000. It's intended to foster collaboration between the US and UK, according to statements by Serpentine CEO Bettina Correct. The nomination process will involve a rotating panel of art historians, curators, and artists, and it will be awarded biannually over the span of 10 years to 5 international artists, each of whom will receive that prize and be given a solo exhibition at both galleries. And the New York-based Andy Warhol Foundation will distribute a total of $1.04 million to 31 writers working across 4 categories: articles, books, short-form writing, and translation, for its 2025 Arts Writers Grant. Artforum explains that program, launched in 2006, is aimed at, quote, sustaining critical writing about contemporary art and at ensuring that such writing remains a valued way of engaging with the visual arts, end quote. A sentiment echoed by Pradeep Dalal, the director of the Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant. The foundation has distributed over $13.5 million to more than 450 writers to date. And a teeny tiny last story before we go: Tamagotchi is celebrating its 30th anniversary with a grand exhibition in Tokyo exploring the enduring appeal of the nostalgic digital creature. Held at the Roppongi Museum, it will feature immersive installations, limited edition Tamagotchi models, and merchandise running from January 7th through February 2nd of 2026. And there you have it, honeys, the buzz for the week. Be sure to stay tuned for that upcoming interview, as well as our Holly Jolly special dropping next week. Stay warm, stay safe, keep hydrating or dehydrating. Your skin will thank you. And in every sense, take care. We will talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.